Russia broke free from the shackles of Soviet reign more than 10 years ago. Today, believers are once again free to express their faith, and Orthodox Christians have regained their place in a country they have helped shape for over a millennium. Russia's Catholics, who number just 1,300,000 and are a much smaller group, are also keen to live in peace with the country's other citizens. The majority of Russia's Catholics can be found in communities of German, French, and in particular Polish origin. This can create problems. Coexistence would appear to be far from simple. Indeed, in some cases, there is even evidence of ingrained misunderstanding. But both sides are aware of this problem, and all, above all those of most modern means, are demonstrating a true willingness to solve it. So, will the followers of the Orthodox and Catholic churches become the Cain and Abel of Russia's newfound freedom, or will they be united by common hope? Previously a journalist with the daily newspaper La Croix, Father Bernard Lelianec is the current priest of Saint Louis of the French.
In May 1989, I travelled to Russia with Cardinal Lustigen. I was invited by the Russian Orthodox Church to spend a year in the monastery of the Trinity of St. Serge. It was the first time that a Catholic priest had been officially invited to live for a whole year in the monastery of the Trinity of St. Serge, which is essentially the very heart of Orthodox Russia. It is the place where all of Orthodox Russia comes to regain spiritual strength. When I arrived at the monastery in Russia, I didn't know the language at all and had only very little knowledge of Eastern traditions. Like a child, I had to learn to live in this new country.
Assumptionist Robert Fortin also served a ministry in Moscow during the last stages of communism.
The Soviets were seeking recognition from the other countries of the world. President Roosevelt agreed to this, but under specific conditions. And one of these conditions was that American nationals should be granted freedom to pursue the religion of their choice in the Soviet Union, just as they would at home. It was thus that the American chaplain became the priest of St. Louis of the French.
The parish of St. Louis of the French was created in 1789 by the French community living in exile after the Revolution. The church, which was built in 1830, is one of the only churches in Moscow that has never once been closed, even during the darkest hours of Stalinism and despite being located on the doorstep of the KGB building. Every Sunday in this church, a series of masses is held for the different communities belonging to the church, French and Russian of course, but also Spanish, British, African, and even Vietnamese and Chinese.
I believe that a problem exists between the Russian Catholics and Russian Orthodoxy. To my mind, it's essentially a political issue. They really aren't very different. There are perhaps a few disparities in terms of liturgy, but basically the two are the same.
But a different light is shed on this hope by those living in both worlds day to day through their relationships with their partners.
I focus on the positive things about the Orthodox Church. My husband is Orthodox, but it's not easy. Russia's Orthodox Church is terribly insular and wary of Catholics. I feel this resistance much more here than I did in my dealings with Orthodox followers in France. Here it can be hard.
I have quite a different view of the Catholic Church, having married a Catholic. And I think my wife also sees the Orthodox Church differently than if she had not married an Orthodox. So it's an enriching experience for both of us. I don't believe that it drives us apart. On the contrary, I would say it brings us together. But it does make our joint life difficult because we are not able to share everything we do.
This incomplete union and the suffering it causes symbolize what is happening on a larger scale between these two Christian faiths in Russia. Although persecution and the desecration of churches began as soon as Lenin and the Bolsheviks came into power, it was Stalin who instigated a truly murderous campaign in Russia in this respect. The state was determined to eradicate all images of any faith other than communism. Today, the stories told by the victims of this campaign and the tremendous injustices they suffered seem quite unbelievable. Orthodox and Catholic Christians across the Soviet Union were united by this process of extermination. Irina Sofroniskaya often shares her memories of this era with Father Lulyanek. She knows that he is able to understand and relive with her what is essentially the basis of her faith today.
I grew up in a family of Russian intellectuals, but my mother had most influence on me. She worked at the university. We were a very discreet family. They never said that they were religious. When I was 17 years old, my father was arrested. I was in a state of shock. He was sentenced to 10 years of isolated imprisonment with no correspondence. We knew then that that meant certain and immediate death. I never saw my father again after his arrest.
With just one word from Stalin, millions of Christians were deported to camps in Siberia. "200,000 priests from both faiths were arrested and more than 3/4 were sentenced to death and executed. Monseigneur Pinevaux, who was consecrated Bishop of Moscow and given the task of restoring the Catholic hierarchy in Russia, had his visa cancelled and was expelled from the country. Mrs. Ott, the woman in charge of the parish of St. Louis, was arrested with her daughter and both were sent to the camps for 15 years.
It was All Saints' Day, and I was coming out of church. In Russia, All Saints' Day is a day like any other. But as a Catholic, I was celebrating it as I usually would. After the Eucharistic fast, I was hungry, and I was heading towards the university. I stopped off in a shop to buy something to eat, and as I was coming out, a young man approached me. I didn't know him. He spoke to me in a brusque and familiar manner and said, "Come with me, Irina, we need to talk." He guided me into a car and I was saying, "You've made a mistake, I don't know you." And then I saw the Lubyanka buildings and I knew what it meant. At first I was imprisoned with 2 other women, then sent to an isolated cell. I can say that God never left me during that terrible ordeal. There was no proper trial. It was presided over by the Troika. My every act, my entire life had been recorded in detail. I was accused of treason, of high treason, and was sentenced to 25 years in a gulag. I felt as if the world was crumbling beneath my feet. I was deported by train to Karaganda, and then we walked the last stretch to the camp. It was very difficult to communicate with the men's camp, as there were 3-meter-high walls and electric barbed fences between the two. A priest managed to contact me and offered me communion. He was working in the sawmill in the neighbouring camp. I knew where he hid the small box he used as a ciborium. I took communion on my own using that tiny precious box for the first time on Good Friday. I managed to develop a bond with the priest, and when I was released, he gave me what I needed for communion for my return journey. Here is the small book I wrote myself from my own memories, and which contains the Mass proceedings and all of the prayers. A group of nuns also sent me a copy of the Gospel in an iron box, with a false bottom and with butter in the top half.
It wasn't until the death of Stalin in 1953 that this regime of terror began to wane. Although several churches have now been rebuilt, including in particular the Orthodox Cathedral of the Holy Saviour, which was destroyed in 1931, a great many are still just remains from this era of death and destruction. Throughout this entire time, the Association Aid to the Church in Need stood by those who had been left with virtually no remnants of their faith. Didier Rance, National Director of the Association, has been following the tribulations of the Catholic Church for many years.
Elle a souffert, beaucoup souffert, persécution.
The Catholic Church suffered greatly from a persecution that was perhaps much more intense than for other faiths, due to the universal nature of Catholicism. The essential instigators of this persecution in Soviet Russia, and first and foremost Stalin, saw the Catholic Church as a type of Trojan horse operated by the Vatican. There were two major periods of persecution. The first took place during the 1920s and 30s and resulted purely and simply in the elimination of the small Russian Byzantine Catholic Church, followed by the persecution of Russian Catholics, who were mostly non-Russians from the Baltic states and Poland. Then, after the Second World War, when the Soviet Union expanded westwards, the Catholic Church of Ukraine was again destroyed. This was a large church with a congregation of more than 4 million. Shortly after this, the Catholic Church in the Baltic states and the west of what had become Soviet Belarusia was persecuted.
I was freed on the 3rd of June 1954. I was frightened to go back to church, and that fear stayed with me for a long time after my release. My mother didn't want me to go to church either, as she was afraid the same thing might happen again. When Father Bernard came, I felt I was on familiar ground and was able to recreate my bond with the Assumptionist spirit. I remember the first time I confessed to you. I told you everything I had been through. Previously, I had been too terrified to tell my story in confession.
Today, the parish community lives life simply and to the full, all thanks to their rediscovered freedom. And, as Professor Anatoly Krasikov, former director of the TASS agency, stresses, the freedom enjoyed by these people today is greater than ever before.
Well, the situation today in Russia is quite unusual. On the one hand, this is the first time in our entire history throughout the last millennium that we have experienced such a high degree of religious freedom. If we consider that at the start of the 20th century, until the start of the 20th century, converting from orthodoxy to another religion or faith was deemed a crime of treason and was punishable in accordance with the penal code of the Russian Empire. Following this, we underwent almost an entire century of state atheism, which had well-known repercussions. Finally, during the 1990s, we were at last able to live in an environment of general freedom and freedom of conscience, and in particular, freedom of religious expression.
But the newfound freedoms, and moreover the ability of these churches to exercise these freedoms in post-communist Russia, have not erased, but in some regards exacerbated the differences between these two faiths.
It is with great regret that we are witnessing the development of proselytism in Ukraine, Russia, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. A proselytic attitude towards sister churches is unacceptable. When Catholic dignitaries refer to Russia as a spiritual void, or as a place requiring missionary work, we cannot agree. The 1,000-year-old history of the Orthodox Church in Russia tells us, indeed shows us, that Russia is a country of faith, a Christian country, in which this church, that was persecuted for such a long time, must be helped. I do not agree with these accusations. Proselytism is the desire to convert followers of one faith to another faith. I am wholly against this type of policy. In particular, subsequent to the Second Vatican Council. That council clearly stated that the Eastern churches offer a road towards salvation of the soul that is just as valid as that offered by the Catholic Church. Followers can be saved in either of these churches. There is no need to leave one in order to join the other. But the real issue at hand here is that of the freedom of choice of Christians to join one or other group. Or in other words, to exercise their freedom of conscience in selecting their faith.
Here we have reached the heart of a problem that will remain insurmountable for as long as there is no real will to become more open at the very top of the hierarchy.
It is true that today our relations are very strained. And that's a serious situation, not only for us, but also for the Orthodox Church. We are providing a very poor example to all of the Christians who worship within our two churches. The division is a gaping wound that continues to bleed on the body of our Christ. The best outcome for the Church as a whole, would be a rapid solution. We must endeavour to respond to the issues facing the whole world today with one united voice. A joint response will be stronger and better heard.
Renewed efforts for reconciliation are being made both inside Russia and internationally. Within Russia, Monsignor Menini, the new Catholic nuncio, symbolizes the fresh new relationship between the Catholic Church and the Russian political and religious authorities. After presenting his credentials to President Putin, he insisted on meeting the Patriarch Alexis II, who received him warmly, expressing the common hopes for closer cooperation. Encouraging this mutual understanding and unity has been, and continues to be, the central objective of a number of Catholic and Orthodox media initiatives supported by the international Catholic charity Aid to the Church in Need. One such initiative is the Catholic Orthodox press agency Blagovest Info, founded in Moscow in 1993. 1 year later, the Catholic Orthodox radio network, the Christian Social Channel, started broadcasting on the Moscow airwaves. Dmitry Vlasov is the director of the Blagovest Info press agency.
С тех пор и вот до нынешнего дня основная линия агентства оставалась неизменной.
Since its foundation, our agency has not strayed from its original guidelines: objectivity, impartiality, and to provide information about all religions in Russia, and especially about the Catholic and the Orthodox churches. There are currently many media sources in our country that write about religion. Some of them work professionally and effectively, but not all can be said to give sincere and honest accounts. Some media sources have a predetermined opinion and have prejudices against those who they consider as their opponents. Avoiding this kind of practice has always been and continues to be our goal.
In 1996, through cooperation with the Catholic Radio and Television Network in Germany, the television studio Blagovest Media was founded in Russia. As stated by its director, Nikolai Goryachkin, the goal of Blagovest Media is to be a bridge between the two spiritual cultures of Catholicism and Orthodoxy.
Мы показываем фильмы, созданные на католических студиях всего мира, мы показываем их в России.
We broadcast in Russia films produced from Catholic studios around the world. We work with a variety of Russian stations, both nationally and regionally. We have broadcast thousands of hours of Catholic programming. But we are also collecting a catalogue and showing Orthodox programs in the West. During the year, we produce between 2 and 4 films which are devoted to revealing interreligious initiatives and addressing current events in the Catholic and Orthodox churches and in society. We also have a series on the Catholic and Orthodox sacraments. Catholics from around the world help us in this work. We make an effort to address the similarities between the two religions, the common history, a similar culture, thousands of years of coexistence, and all of this is much more important than that which divides us. We should be aware of the differences, but we must remember that we are really one, Christ's Church.
Rome, the heart of Catholicism for 2,000 years. On St. Peter's Square, all Catholics feel at home. This is a place that is neither in Italy nor in Europe. It is the heart of a world in which everyone, no matter where they are from, Pope Benedict XVI is working to gather around him the faithful from across the globe with a view to fostering unity and spiritual communion. Of principal concern are the relations with the Orthodox Church.
The most important thing of all is that we understand that both the Catholic and Orthodox churches in Russia have a long-standing history. They have been here for centuries. And the weight of history can be a heavy burden to bear and a load which is difficult to shed. I believe that in order to get to the heart of the matter, we need to shed some of this baggage, in order to build on the present and look to the future afresh through the eyes of the Gospel.
Indeed, there have been recently new initiatives at finding common ground. Both the Catholic and the Russian Orthodox Church have recognized new dangers facing society, that of relativism and materialism, and the need and desire of both these churches to work together to meet these challenges confronting humanity.